Looking for even more unique and creative movie content? Become a patron. Choose between 3 levels and you'll get benefits like a personalized membership card, exclusive shows, early instant reactions to new releases, episode voting power, live streams, and more. Join today. Patreon.com/Binge Movies. Coming to you from the last video store in the universe, it's Binge Movies, episode 125. I'm Jason. This is the show that ranks and eliminates movies to determine which ones are worthy of preservation for all time, even beyond the end times. On this episode, we rank a king. This week, I am joined by someone who normally watches The Thing, but this week, we're going to watch some King. Rather, we watched some King, past tense. I'm talking about the little boy that lives in my mouth. I'm talking about the first respectable Australian I've ever had on this podcast. I prefer my Australian cities to not sound like speech impediments, if you know what I mean. I am here with B. Dizzle. How you doing?
Mate, I'm excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to talk to our friend Paul about that intro just there.
Who?
Paul from The Countdown.
Never heard of him. Let me ask you this. I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to tell me whether or not you understand what I'm saying to you, okay?
Okay.
Okay, here we go. I got the giggles. Rise up lights.
Razor blades, mate. You use them to shave. Use them to shave your face.
I'm going to do it one more. I'm going to do it one more time. All right. Razor blades.
Razor blades.
What I'm saying is rise up lights.
I'm just hearing razor blades.
It was a test to see
check my Aussiness.
How you would hear it. Yeah. And you heard razor blades.
Wait, were you actually saying rise up lights? Really?
Rise up lights.
Oh my God, no, mate.
Rise up lights.
Mate,
see?
You do a great Aussie accent, I'll tell you that.
No. So the secret is that somebody else told me this. This is a shout out to the lady Juan. She's the one that turned me on to this, fellow podcaster. She's got her own show, Screen Run. Check it out. But she was like the surefire way for a Yankee, for an American, for a dumb, ugly American to sound like a sophisticated Australian is to say that the 3 words rise up lights just say as you would a normal sentence. So I'm not affecting an Australian accent.
Right.
In my native accent, I'm just saying rise up lights.
It's uncanny. It is literally.
It's uncanny.
It is. That's incredible.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's an equivalent 3 words that we could put together that all of a sudden B. Dizzle is going to sound like he's from Saskatchewan or something, or from like Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I'm not sure, but I like to find what that is.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do some research.
I will say this. Yeah, I will say this. Of all of the Australian voices that I have had the pleasure of listening to, yours is quite melodious.
Oh,
I love your
that.
voice, man. Yeah, it's so soothing. Like you, or I don't know. I know you work in VFX and film stuff. Have you ever thought about being a therapist or like a elementary art teacher or something? You have just such a mellow. Even when you're like don't like a movie, you're just so tranquil about it and not boring. I'm not saying boring. You're soothing. Have you ever thought about that?
I appreciate that. I have done some voiceover work before. I was doing an animation once and I just used my voice as a little filler to time it before I got a professional one. And the client was like, oh, yeah, we really like that voice.
Yeah.
All right.
It's not an ask. You're not putting it on. We talked a little bit before this. You told me that the Binge Movies is too long for you to listen to. So you have no. You don't even know who I am or why you're here. But I know why you're here. You're here because you are arguably one of the most popular independent Australian podcasters of all time.
That's incredibly kind of you to say.
It's true.
I'm here because
I was
true. very
You know
What
your
I was
numbers.
telling you is what I was telling you is I don't do a lot of guest spots, and I was very excited to do this one though. This is my first guest spot at least since my co-host left.
Yeah.
And even then we had stopped doing guest spots for probably about a year or two before that. So I'm excited, man. This is fun. And one of my favorite topics when you reached out to me and said because I think you said you had King and I don't want to spoil anything, but Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
And I famously hate Tom Hanks.
Yes.
So, but I love Stephen King, so I'm excited for this.
Well, let's get into that for a second, okay? Stephen King, right? Obviously a prolific author, terrible filmmaker, has had many terrible film adaptations. We're not doing the bad ones. We're doing the good ones. These are all
according to critics.
According to critics, these are all the good ones. And which makes this kind of a little bit extra challenging, right? Because if we had more of his filmography in here, well, it's like, okay, well, maybe this one's like a guilty pleasure, or I kind of like this, or I saw it as a kid, it left an impact on me.
Yeah.
And this one's absolutely terrible or whatever, maximum overdrive. And, it would be like a little bit easier because you could diversify, you could spread these out. Yeah. We're not just going to be reviewing them, we're ranking them, right? So as we go through these chronologically, we'll be ranking them. And the fact that they're all kind of, they're within proximity of each other, at least 4 of the 5 of them, it's going to be more challenging. So what's your history with King adaptations, and what's your history with the man, the author, Stephen King?
So I'm a massive fan of Stephen King. I've spoken about on the show before my kind of relationship with horror and stuff. I grew up, like my mum was a massive horror fan, so I grew up watching horrors really young. It was no different with reading. My aunties were prolific readers, and when I was about 8 or 9, they just lent me a whole bunch of King books, which I know it sounds like I'm a bit young for that, but I just devoured them. I love his writing, and I think I agree with you. A lot of the adaptations have not worked well, and I think that's because what King is so great at is detail, especially character detail.
Yeah,
like if you've read some of his best books like It or The Stand, or even I love some that aren't that popular, like Needful Things, where his bread and butter is just delving into characters. And I truly believe that he doesn't plot out a story before he starts. I think he starts with the characters and he lets them form the story. And that's where his real strength is.
Yeah, his writing definitely has that feeling. Yeah. And his better works. I took a beach trip a few years ago, and I took along The Stand. My dad was a huge Stephen King fan, and all the way, to some of the later works that aren't that great. And really loved the Dark Tower series, this, that, whatever. Yeah. And so he had passed away, and it had been a couple years, and I was going to go on a trip, and I just kind of wanted to do something. I wanted to explore something that I never had really explored before, almost like I was traveling down a similar road that my dad had gone down by reading this book, if that makes any sense,
Yeah, I get that, yep.
And I got the unabridged Stand, so it's got the extra stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that's a long book in general. The unabridged version's even longer. I want to say it's around like 1,800 pages, something like that. And I read the entire thing cover to cover, almost on a 6-day vacation, and I came home and finished it like the day after I came home from a vacation.
Yeah.
I just laid on the beach, got roasted like a lobster. Probably took several years off of my life. And I was engrossed, especially up into a certain point. Once they start getting into the recordings of the different town hall meetings they have, and you're just reading like meeting minutes.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, once we get to the free zone, it kind of stalls out a little bit. And then, of course, it picks up a little bit. But the first, I don't know. I'd have to say like roughly half of that book. I mean, it's a thick book. It's a page turner, but it feels like the world that he's building is unfolding as he's writing it. It's like he's building it as we go, but it also feels at the same time so rich with detail and character detail, like you said. And the psychological detail of his characters. He really gets into the soul and the mind of his characters. And to your point, I think that's extraordinarily difficult to translate.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I found hardest with this binge is, as you say, ranking them. It was really hard for me to approach these almost as their own entities.
Yeah.
Because for
Yep.
most of these, I have read and loved the books, and I found it really hard to separate and go. I mean, of course, they're not as good as the books. Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think, some of these are getting very close to as good, if not maybe one of them is better than the source material.
Mm.
But for most of them, that's so hard to get across.
Yeah, and I think what's really hard too is we think of him as a horror author.
Yeah.
Obviously, two of these on here are not scary movies per se.
Yeah.
They're from shorter stories or novellas or short
Mhm.
novels that he's done. And he's written a lot of different stuff. And when he does get into the spooky and the scary and stuff like that, a lot of it's existential. A lot
Yes.
of it is psychological. And what is psychologically horrifying when you're reading a book
Mhm.
or you're listening to even an audiobook does not necessarily translate to a visual medium.
Yeah.
So there's always this thing that in the adaptation, especially of his more horror-based works, that in the adaptation, once we go visual, it can get kind of goofy.
Yeah.
It can get kind of silly. And that's always the risk you run with King. And the thing is, so that tone is even sometimes present in his actual writing too. There is a little bit of like a weird subversive humor to his writing as well.
Yeah.
And so I think he's just a very, for lack of a better term, like idiosyncratic author. I think he's just very, very difficult to translate to the screen.
Yeah, true. I always found it interesting that he has been classed as a horror writer. And I get that because a lot of his books do have horror elements to them.
Yeah.
But for example, even It, like there are large chunks of It that are closer to Stand By Me than they are to any of his other kind of straight horror novels. Like, and I think that character and that feeling of nostalgia is something he does incredibly well. And I think that it's kind of just, Carrie was his first published novel, which obviously is much more of a straight horror. And so he just kind of got pegged as that. And people do kind of, I think, have a tendency to forget that he is prolific.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you brought it up. So I think I'm looking at my watch. I think it's about that time. I think it's time we get to our first film. Of course, we're talking about 1976's Carrie, which currently has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes.
If you have a taste for terror, you have a date with Carrie. A new film by Brian De Palma, starring Sissy Spacek, Piper Laurie, and John Travolta in his first motion picture role. If you have a taste for terror, you have a date with Carrie. Rated R.
Carrie was directed by pervert Brian De Palma with the screenplay by Lawrence D. Cohen. It's based on Carrie by Stephen King. It is the triumphant return of Nancy Allen, last seen in RoboCop. It's the triumphant return of Edie McClung, last seen in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And it is the triumphant return of P.J. Souls, last seen in Halloween. This film was released November 3rd, 1976, on a budget of $1.8 million. It made $33.8 million in the United States and Canada. Ex-Vangelical gets the ultimate revenge on purity culture by kissing, dating hello, and psychically destroying her high school.
A teenage girl who is psychologically tortured by her mother and classmates discovers that she has psychic abilities and uses them to enact her revenge.
Okay, this is a film, my friend, that the first time I watched it, it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
There was something I think about the gauzy almost aesthetic of it. It's visually at times very gauzy, very, very blurred, very blown out. It feels very 70s.
Oh yeah, this is a movie that feels 76.
Yeah. Like 100%. And not like gritty, grimy 70s, just like 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, maybe being a little bit younger and being a little bit dumber when it comes to movies. it just didn't really work for me. It also had been hyped up a little bit. It's Carrie. Just the name Carrie is one of those things, at least stateside, that worked itself into the zeitgeist. And so it was just one of those, you just knew what it was. It meant somebody going crazy, right?
Yeah.
And psychically, and so I was like, I watched it and it just didn't really work for me. I revisited it. It worked a little better. I don't know what it is about this time. When I watched it this time, I thought this movie was fantastic.
Right.
And the only thing that I can say that I think informed this was I watched a few years ago. I watched Badlands for the first time.
Yeah.
The Terrence Malick, Sissy Spacek, and Martin Sheen film. Right. It's a kind of a precursor to Natural Born Killers in a weird Terrence Malick sort of way.
Yeah.
And she's not playing that character at all, but in this movie, but I saw something in Spacek that I never saw in her before I watched Badlands.
Yeah.
And then I realized just what a great actress she is. And also that she has this sort of unconventional appeal, even sex appeal to her.
Yep.
That the people who were filming her and shooting her and her herself in her performance are much more mindful of. And I didn't get it. It didn't unlock for me until Badlands, where I'm like, oh, Sissy Spacek is kind of an unconventional sex symbol in a weird way.
Yeah.
She's a taboo. She's this like nymphette. It's really how she kind of presents herself. And because she was, 27 or 28 when she did this movie, and she looks 15. She looks.
Yeah, she does. Yeah.
She looks like a high schooler. And so it's like when the movie opens with the long, gauzy shower scene of her sensually massaging her own body, I was like, well, first of all, I was like, this is definitely opening your movie with full frontal nudity in slow motion.
Yes, of what is supposed to be schoolgirls.
Of what are supposed to be high school girls is the most De Palma way of doing it.
Yeah.
But what I realized, right, is that it's not just Brian De Palma being a pervert, although he is. It is the sensuality of that shower scene then transforming into her first menstruation, first period. And her horror at that is absolute classic horror sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's also classic De Palma and kind of classic King. This weird mixture of coming of age, which is a theme that runs through almost all of his work, right? Somebody somewhere, but coming of age. And then it's almost as if, and it, like, this is where it works so well. I think why I appreciate this movie was it's almost as if in that scene, she's discovering her body for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's like her sexual awakening actually causes her puberty in a way, or her first period, which, that timetable is a little screwy, but what it does is it latches her sexuality with the horrific.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again is something King often plays with and does well. Yeah, I agree. I think it is easy to think of that opening scene as not having a purpose. It is easy to watch it and just go, wow, we're opening with 5 minutes slow-mo of, teenage girls. But I agree with you. It really does play into those later themes and stuff. I almost had the opposite thing to you, though, where, like I said, I grew up with a lot of horror. From my memory, this was one of the first ones that I'd seen. And I loved this film. And I had the same experience the other night when I rewatched the Amityville Horror for the first time in a long time. And I was like, wow, this movie is not anywhere near as good as I thought it was. And I still enjoyed Carrie, and there's still a lot of things that I like about it. And like you say, I think Spacek she's brilliant in this film. She carries it, and for me is the reason to watch this film. But I didn't love this film as much as I'd remembered. And it's certainly not, if you're like around our age, or someone who didn't grow up watching 70s horror, I can't say I'd recommend this to somebody, because I think it would turn them off that kind of era of horror films, because it is incredibly dated today, which you have to separate, because you can't look at every film through the lens of the time you're watching it, because that's not when it was made. But
Right.
there are elements of this film that are so dated now that it almost becomes a little hard to watch at times because it comes across more funny than scary for me.
I didn't interpret it as necessarily being scary.
Yeah.
Right. What stood out to me more were the themes.
Yeah.
Again, like this association between sexual awakening and blood, and which equal guilt and shame. And then guilt and shame is obviously the influence of the mother figure.
Yeah.
But also like her attraction to this man leads to the people pouring the blood on her. So again, it bookends the movie, right? There's sensuality that leads to blood, right? And then the mocking and the trauma of bullying and so forth. But then we cycle back to it with this moment that she has with her date, which is friendly, but also like she kind of puts her foot down with her mom and she asserts her power. And no, I want to be a normal kid. I want to be like a sexual being, for lack of a better term. And then the blood happening again, and that being the thing that unleashes like the death.
Yeah.
And that like I thought all of those themes were strung together so beautifully in this movie that I thought the visual elements, the story elements, and the character development all the way across the board just was done so masterfully. I think, this has some King tropes in it, of course.
Yeah.
One of which, of course, is he always has he's got a hard on for kind of taking the piss out of religious figures.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're always mad zealots or like corrupt, hypocritical institutional leaders, abusers, devils in disguise, sometimes literally the devil in disguise, or frauds or something like that. And so here we have this extremely zealous mother figure played by Piper Laurie, who I think is like bordering on parody. She's so over the top in the way she's doing it. But I thought it worked. I thought that performance really worked because she's over the top, but in a way that like old time religious zealots are kind of over the top.
Yeah, that's
people
fair.
who are religious zealots. I mean, to be a zealot literally means so you're known for your zeal.
Yeah.
So you're known for being over the top. And I think that this movie also very subtly contains one of my all-time, like the greatest horror twists that it always works for me. It pushes my buttons here. And it's that when the antagonist isn't exactly right, but they're not wrong either.
Yeah.
Right? And like the thing that's subversive about this is Piper Laurie is crazy and she's dealing with her own guilt due to sexual trauma, being raped.
Yep.
And marital rape and all these sort of things and her previous lifestyle. And she's, taking on this religion to cope with all of that. But the great thing about her is when she's like this power isn't for good and it's going to lead, they'll laugh at you and it's going to lead to destruction and you dismiss out of hand because it again sounds like the ravings of a religious lunatic who's crazy about everything. But she's not wrong about this. And in fact, Carrie's powers may actually be from the devil in a way.
Yeah.
Like it may not be. It may be a natural phenomenon or it may be of the devil. But the movie does such a good job of getting us on Carrie's side. We never question for a second, even though by this point we know the ending.
Yeah.
We never question for a second that she's actually of the devil.
Yep.
Even though we know she's psychic, and even though her psychic abilities are only shown as being destructive.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. That is one thing that the film does really nicely, which again, I think goes back to King's writing, is that it feels believable from start to finish that like, you don't even question it. This is just a girl with psychic abilities. You don't actually, it almost doesn't even cross your mind where they came from. Like it's just, because it just feels so real that she has them.
I think what it's pulling on is this, at least in the States, again, there was this rise in alternative religions within the mid to late 60s, but that led to like the resurgence of spiritualism and the New Age movement and personal development and a lot of pseudoscience in the 70s. And so I think like in the cultural moment, the reason why it's effective is because people were just sort of more open to these ideas that psychic phenomena was real or parapsychological stuff was real.
Yeah.
And it was just sort of, it was beginning to be mainstreamed as something that was possible. And a lot of research was actual legitimate research was being done in those fields at this time. What's more amazing about it, though, is as dated as obviously the fashion is, and even some of the direction, is we're not in that moment anymore.
Yeah.
We're in the moment. We're not in the I mean, in a way, fringe ideas have never more popular, but at the same time, they're popular, but also still fringe.
Yes.
We look at them derisively. And yet in this movie, it still kind of freaking works that, yeah, she goes to the library, she reads a book, and she's like, Mama, some people got psychic powers. and we're just like, yeah, some people just have psychic powers. You know what I mean? It's just, I know I'm sort of running at the mouth about this movie, but again, like rewatching it for this episode was the first time like it kind of clicked for me. I'm like, oh, this is a good movie.
Yeah.
Not necessarily scary, but a good movie.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely still enjoy it. And while some elements are dated, there are some things that really still hold up tremendously well. Like you said, I think the screenplay and the narrative is timeless. And it is such a part of the zeitgeist. If you say the word Carrie to somebody, even if they know nothing about this story, have never heard of this film, I think they still picture the prom scene because it's just so iconic and ingrained. And I gotta say, like that blood and everything, like the effects in this film hold up incredibly well for a film that is from 1976.
Yeah, I think that they obviously a lot is done in camera.
Yeah.
And a lot was done like when it has to be, and I mean, I can defer to you on this. When an effect has to be done in camera, it has to mostly be able to pass in camera. And it's not the same as doing it, after the fact and then doing a composite shot or something like that, and you can kind of fudge the details. It's like it has to pass the lens test.
Yeah.
And the fact that these are, practical effects done in camera.
Yeah.
I think almost all of them, if not all of them.
Yeah, yeah.
They pass the lens test, even 40 years later, 50 years later almost.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's even simple things just like the blood. Like you watch a lot of old movies and fake blood stands out really, really strong. I think this, for me, is the first film that I can really remember the blood looking that realistic. And, like people think of the prom scene, the blood in that scene, but even that opening scene where she first menstruates, that looks like real blood. That is incredibly detailed.
It's very, that whole scene is very effective because of the,
definitely.
The hyper reality and then also just reality somehow. And when De Palma was on the top of his game, which arguably he is here.
Yeah.
He has that ability to make these like hyper real sort of movies. And obviously some of that is him aping Hitchcock. But it's the same sort of Hitchcockian effect where it's like hyper real and certain things or certain shots or certain reactions are very like out beyond the scope of like movies that are just like that. I think of the detective, falling down the staircase.
Yeah.
In Psycho, the surrealness of just how that was shot, or even the dolly zoom Hitchcock helped make famous. It's like, whoa, it's just such a weird, like hyper real effect and hyper real performance note or something. But then it's also grounded in the real world.
Yeah.
And I think De Palma at his best is doing that, and he's doing that here.
Yeah.
Where it feels like she's really as kind of weird as this is to say, it feels like she really is a teenage girl undergoing her period for the first time, and then is like horrifically traumatized by it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what makes that moment work so well is just that kind of typical horror trope, but done so well here, where you completely juxtapose a moment, like you said. Like the film opens with, it's like really soft, quiet music, and she's just rubbing her body, and then all of a sudden she's screaming and losing it frantically, and it works so well because you feel so bad for this girl. And as over the top as that moment can be seen today, like I do think if you watch this movie through the modern lens, the performance is over the top for sure. And not just her, the other girls in the classroom. Like, I
Yeah,
like to
yeah.
think that that's not a moment that would happen in today's time, but I'm probably wrong. Bullying is still very much alive and well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very effective moment in this film.
You know, you mentioned the juxtaposition or sort of the book ending of it. You know, she's running, begging for help as blood is all over the place, and she's scared and doesn't know what's happening, and she thinks something horrifically unnatural is happening because of this sheltered fundamentalist religious upbringing that she has. She's never been told at all about it, her body or you know, human development or sexuality or anything. All that's dirty, all that's bad, all that is sin. And so she's like she's someone who's ironically, again, here we go with the themes. She's somebody who starts the movie almost detached from her own body. And it's almost like her psychic abilities have developed because her mind is so gnostically divorced from her physical self.
Yeah.
Like, I know that's weird. It's like, but thematically, there's something psychologically there where she was disconnected from her own gender to the point that as a 15, 16-year-old girl or however old she is in this, she doesn't know what a period is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not just that she's never had one.
Yeah.
She doesn't know what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's like you put somebody on that much, you divorce somebody that much from their own like incarnate state, and what's going to happen? It leaves room for something disincarnate to enter the fray, which, you know, we don't know what that is in her case, but there's something else beyond the body that's going on here. Juxtapose that to the end, she's covered in blood again, but rather than running for help to these people who mocked her, the people who mocked her are running for help. And there's been an awakening with her that's not a natural occurrence.
Yeah.
It's an unnatural or supernatural occurrence. And it all ends with them running and fleeing from her. And that whole thing is that whole prom sequence is iconic for so many different reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I loved about this time around was before the melee, it's just a prom.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Yeah.
Even like the Nancy Allen shenanigans, you know, the pig's blood and all that, like we cut to that sparingly.
Yeah.
So there's just long minutes of just them, are like basically her date learning to see her as a person.
Yeah.
And not necessarily being romantically interested in her, but just really finding himself enjoying her company and enjoying her as a person. And like, which he didn't expect to. Yeah. And so it's like, it just plays so wonderfully, which is a great setup because that's what we need for the gut punch at the end.
Yeah.
We need everything not to be going like, oh, like a fairy tale. We need everything to be going like almost grounded, normal.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation at the table seems kind of naturalistic. The way they are talking to each other, the way, it's just, it feels very much like, oh, this is like just a good time at the prom.
Yeah.
And then we enter into, once the gut punch happens, that's when we enter the dreamlike state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like at the peak of her fantasy, as we enter the dream state, the peak of her, they get the award, and it goes all like homecoming king. And that's when it gets surreal, like, oh, it's so wonderful. And then when that turn happens and it goes from dream to nightmare, and then her nightmare and how she feels about herself manifest in the room and becomes their nightmare. And I noticed something this time, and I'll cut back to you. I noticed something this time. The laughing that she hears from people only occurs in that surreal state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, one of the people she sees up front is the teacher laughing at her, Miss Collins.
Yeah.
But if you look at the scene before we get to the dreamlike state, Miss Collins is leading Nancy Allen's character and PJ Soul's character out of the gymnasium.
Yeah.
She's not even in the room when the pig's blood drops.
Yeah.
So now I'm wondering, and maybe I'm just dumb and I'm coming late to the ball game, but is that laughter only in her mind?
Yeah, well, that's definitely the way I've always read it. That's definitely the way that I feel it happens, is that is I think most of the people in that crowd would just be shocked silent. I don't think anybody would actually be laughing at that moment. And I do think
Yeah,
that's
especially
all in her head. Yeah.
Yeah, their legit homecoming king
Yeah.
is laying there bleeding to death or is dead on the ground. And this girl who, halfway through the night, the whole, that's the other thing. Like when she does show up and she is able to, she's blossomed and she's just her normal, wonderful self.
Yeah.
Other than a couple of the assholes, the rest of the school is pretty inviting of her.
Well,
like,
yeah, exactly. And that's why I definitely think that the laughter is fake. And I think that's one of those, again, those kind of themes that come out even really subtly. Like we've all had that moment where you think, oh, everybody's talking about me. Like I used to be afraid of things like eating at a restaurant alone or something until someone said to me, mate, nobody's looking at you. Like nobody cares.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the feeling I get from this film, is that laughter we're seeing, that's all internal. That's the way that she fears that people feel about her, even though most people probably just don't really think about her. Like,
right.
And that, I think you said it really well before. I think what makes that whole prom scene work so well is that it's so grounded, but when you remember that for her character, what seems grounded to us is a fantasy, like just going to a normal prom and things going fine, that's already beyond her expectations and what she would dream.
That's a great point.
So then when you go from that to, as you say, the real fantasy stuff, she's prom queen and then the bucket hits and everything, it's like that is such a heightened state for Carrie that, that moment just becomes so strong.
And so when it flips, then it flips that strong, but for the negative.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's almost like, it is. It's literally the voice of her mother. What I found interesting about the way that segment plays out, though, is the editing. Because in a modern movie, and I would just use this word as well, a dumber movie, they would cut back and forth between what's happening in the real world.
Yeah.
And then we'd be jumping back from the natural prom to the heightened state prom at least a couple times to be like, this is in the audience, this is in her mind, this is in the audience, this is in her mind. And I think what's interesting is this is not a like sharply edited, like very like, zip, 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 zip sort of paced film. What's interesting is when that moment happens and we're in that surreal like state, the edit is done in such a way as to leave it ambiguous.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of a sudden now we're cutting stuff out and you're not sure what's happening, what's not happening. And before you know it, bam, this everything turns into an EC horror comic.
Yeah.
And we're getting splash panels basically of which he used a couple of times, but it goes nuts here in this movie. And then it's just like we've truly gone comic book at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it gives a real kind of frantic feeling to that prom scene, as it would be like if you're in that audience, you would be frantic is the only word for it. And I think you're right. The kind of under editing there is a technique that is just so rarely used, because most people to give that kind of frantic feeling would be just cut.
Right.
And this film almost takes the opposite approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Once we cross that threshold and everything starts to break loose, once that ambiguous moment of, well, this seems like it's in her head, but they're not like overtly telling us, oh, it's in her head. And then when it really, all begins to break loose, is like at times we're seeing the whole frame, at a time, and then also these pockets of close-up frames of different things. But like, it's such an interesting stylistic choice because it seemingly like comes out of nowhere, but I think it goes back to what you and I were just talking about, which is that it's that heightened fantasy turns into that heightened nightmare.
Yeah.
And it heightens almost to the point of stylistically changing the frame. Does that make any sense? Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like we've gone so high up and so deep down and into so much darkness with Carrie. It's almost like her own psyche, when it breaks, like it breaks the reality of the film.
Yeah.
And now we're in a comic book.
Yeah, I like
or
that.
Horror.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
But that's not something I noticed the first couple of times I watched it. So I know I'm babbling about the movie, but I presume anyone that listens to Billy and Jason talk for 40 minutes about Carrie is on board with being a big time movie lover.
Yeah.
As movie lovers, part of our experience is that the movies change with us as
Definitely.
we change.
Yeah.
So what do you think's changed in you that this, as I just go rogue with this, how much I love this movie?
Yeah.
You're like, it's good, but it's not what I remembered it to be. What do you think's changed?
I think for me, it's just having watched a lot more movies. Like I famously on our show, I get shat on a lot because our very first episode was on 2017's Justice League, and I gave it a 7 out of 10. Because my thing is, I just fucking love movies. You know, as I'm sure you can appreciate, I have such a good time with movies that for a long time, even movies that I disliked, I'd still be like, it's a 6 or a 7, you know, like it's because I love the act of watching a movie. I get so much enjoyment out of it that even if a movie was bad, I just didn't care. And like I said, I don't think this movie's bad by any stretch. And I don't want to jump ahead on, you know, like the structure of your show and give my score now or anything, but it's a good score still. But, you know, in my head, I was like a 10 on this. And this isn't the only film on this list where this has happened, where I was really, really high. And then on this rewatch, I've gone, you know what? There are some things that now that I'm more comfortable critiquing film, I think don't work so well. And it is a shame that I think for this film, a lot of that comes down to things that are now dated. I don't love John Travolta in the film.
Yeah.
And firstly, he just gives Billy's a bad name, which is just something I don't like. So yeah, I still really like the film, but I just think I've learned more to approach film in a bit of a different way. And rather than just how much did I enjoy this film, you know, like I think this is one of, you know, this was King's first book. I don't think he'd really hit those highs of really delving into a character yet. And so I do think that a lot of the characters in this film aren't as fleshed out as they would be in some of his later works. You know, like Carrie and her mother are very well established. Like Chris and Billy, for example, they're kind of characters that in a later King work would really be delved into still. Like they'd probably have whole chapters just focusing on them and their inner workings. And I think in this film, some of those characters, you know, like they're just kind of teen bullies, and it's very two-dimensional. And
well, even on, you know, William Katt's side of things, and it's him and his girlfriend are also like, we have a whole scene with them and Miss Collins, and she's like yelling at them and like, I know what you're doing. And they're like, oh, we're not doing that. And he's kind of laughing. And it's like, what exactly are we to make of their motivation?
Exactly.
Because it's not as if the movie leaves it ambiguous, because part of me was like, okay, is what they're going for ambiguity because we know the end's going to be tragic? So it's ambiguity. Were they really kind the whole time?
Yeah.
Or were they trying to make it up to her because this girl felt guilty for bullying her? Or was it really it's just another form of bullying?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's not how the movie plays out. There's no ambiguity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because when the pig's blood is being set up and Travolta and his goons are going to go slice we see who does it. We see who's doing the prank.
Yeah.
So what we're left with is, kind of this one dimensionality with both the villains and I guess the protagonists outside of Carrie.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think
that is a flaw.
And so I think for me, it's things like that I've just learned to look for better in film. And so I mean, there's only one film out of these 5 that I was actively not looking forward to rewatching. I'd seen all 5 of these before. There was only one film I wasn't looking forward to. And you might know what it is. You might not. I guess we'll get there. But so I still had a hell of a good time with this film. That's for sure.
Let me finish with this question. So at the end of the film, the mother is dying.
Yep.
But she seems to be experiencing either religious ecstasy or an orgasm.
Yeah.
And I recognize that that historically those two are not as like can't differentiate them based on the literature. But she is orgasming seemingly.
Yeah.
She's crying out in ecstasy as she's being martyred. That's the parallel.
Yeah.
And yet, so then what happens is, okay, we think the mother is the antagonist or a antagonist, and she dies. So we've killed the monster.
Yeah.
But then there's the collapse of the house, which I've always just interpreted as psychic powers ran amok, the guilt of losing this person that even though it's her abuser, she's codependent upon, is too much for her to bear. And it just brings that literally the house coming down upon her.
Yeah.
When I watched it this time, I'm like, you could interpret that almost as the wrath of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
That and that God, like this is that Carrie is as a woman, and she's a woman at odds with her creator because she has this unnatural ability. And you could see, like in De Palma's mind, and you could see even in Stephen King's mind, that the God of this world would be that twisted as to like be against the side of a young traumatized girl. Does that make, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, you can definitely see King siding with an allegory like that for sure. Yeah.
And maybe I was just like read way too much into it. And because I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but this time I'm sort of like the way it cuts back and forth between the religious iconography and the house collapsing. It almost seems like the judgment of God or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess there are multiple ways you could read that. You could also flip that and say, well, the house was almost Carrie's prison cell. And so the destruction of it, that's God freeing her. That's God saying, here you go. You're done. You're free of your mother. You're free of this house and this life. And yeah, I guess.
But he kills her in the process.
Well, yeah. But, emotionally and spiritually free, I guess. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
That's an interesting one. Yeah.
So then I want to know, what do we make of the fact that the movie ends with Sue being traumatized?
Yeah.
Or dealing, or at the very least dealing continuing to experience the trauma she's already experienced. Because like the mom's on the phone is like, oh, we'll just move. And some doctor said that they forget about experiences like this. And I'm thinking, she's going to forget about all of her friends and entire high school being psychically butchered at their prom. I don't think so, Bob.
Yeah.
But what we're just left with her screaming.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, that's one of those things where that's just kind of a cool horror moment more than anything you're meant to read into. To me, that's one of those things that I think on this rewatch lessened the film a little bit for me. It's just kind of like, that's how you end a horror film. Yeah, you have to end a horror film on a note like that. Half the time a moment like that sets up for the sequel where you're like, oh no, the bad guy's still out there. And I'm sure that's me being a pessimist and there is more to it than that. But because there
might not be though.
Yeah,
there might not be,
because as you say, at the end of the day in this film, there's no ambiguity. Sue is not a bad person. She was genuinely trying to help Carrie. So for us to end on her being traumatized by it is a bit like, well, geez, is the message don't help people?
That's what I'm trying to get at, right? Is like, I guess what I'm asking you is, what do you think the message of Carrie is? Because obviously you could read it as an anti-bullying film or this, what do you think? Or let me put you like this: in this adaptation of King, what do you think De Palma and the writer want us to gather from that, to walk away from at the end of the movie?
That is a really, really, really interesting question, because I do think that there are a large number of movies where, sadly, I don't think the writers have thought about what the end message is. I think that there's a lot of times where people just have a story to tell, for example, without it always being like a teaching moment, for example, or something. I think there's so many ways you could interpret this film based on your own experience, like anti-bullying, obviously. I mean, honestly, anti-religion, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a really, really hard question. Do you have an answer for it?
I don't. But to go back to your point, like the whole like the judgment of God sort of showing up and God being kind of the ultimate villain of the movie.
Yeah.
That's why I sort of read it. It was like maybe because the mom's so over the top and all of the religious aspects of it are evil, just flat out evil.
Yeah.
Like maybe like we are to believe that like here's Carrie, who really is almost like, yeah, she's killed all these people, but did she do it maliciously? Like what? Like,
yeah.
And yet her end is death. And then the one survivor of the entire catastrophe, who's arguably the one person in the movie who did, yes, she was a part of the bullying, but atoned for her sins,
did good things
throughout the film, is the one that's punished.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I was like, is this like, because it could be interpreted as anti-religion or anti-fundamentalism at the least, is that what we're supposed to be like? Is that the message is like, this God is ugly to women? Or is that my 21st century brain interpreting in 2022?
I think, and I'm probably leaning too much on my knowledge of King rather than the adaptation itself here. One thing that King loves to play with is this idea of torture, and that everybody to some extent is punished. Really, good guy, bad guy, it doesn't matter. Everybody has problems and is tormented by their past or by things that they've done. And so that's really the only way I can place that kind of ending, is that that's just kind of a really King-esque thing that, you know, like Sue, sure, she atoned, she's a good person, but this is still an incident that's going to live with her for the rest of her life. You know, she knows at the end of the day, she still played a part in this, because as you say, that the book ending of the film, everything leads back to that first moment in the shower where she was bullied. And so even though Sue has done what she can to atone for that moment, I think, you know, she still has some knowledge that at the end of the day, she is partly responsible for the deaths of everyone at that prom, because she played a part in bullying Carrie. So, yeah, I don't know. That's the only way I can really place that.
I may have gone a little galaxy brain on you, Billy, but again, when a movie strikes you for whatever reason, just that right moment, your kind of mind opens up to all these different ideas and thoughts and like themes and yeah, it doesn't always happen. When it does, it's interesting, which is why on this rewatch, I'm going to give Carrie a 9 out of 10, but it's only my number 3.
Okay. Interesting. High praise. This film for me on this rewatch is a 7, which is, like I said, still a very good film. I think that what it does that works really, really well. For me, like I said, the big thing this time was the two-dimensionality of some of those characters that just, for me, make it one of the lesser King adaptations, because that's just something that he got so much better at as he went on. So for me, it's number 4.
Okay, understandable. Well, let's move on. If you thought we went galaxy brain on that one, we could come up with a documentary full of conspiracy theories on this one. Of course, I'm talking about 1980's The Shining, which currently has an 86% on Rotten Tomatoes.
The Shining, a masterpiece of modern horror, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, rated R, opens Friday, June 13. Check newspapers for local listings.
This was directed and co-written by Stanley Kubrick, and the other co-writer in that was Diane Johnson. It is based on The Shining by Stephen King. This is the triumphant return of Jack Nicholson, last seen in As Good as It Gets. It's the triumphant return, briefly, of Tony Burton, last seen in Rocky. This film was released May 23rd, 1980 in the United States and April 2nd, 1980 in the United Kingdom. On a budget of $19 million, it made $47 million. Emotionally threadbare family winters in a hotel and is swallowed by isolation and madness.
A former alcoholic writer takes on a job as the seasonal caretaker for an old hotel where things begin to get spooky as his mental state unravels.
First off, I think the most interesting element of this is that Tony is Danny from the future. If you know King's work, that's what he ends up doing, right?
So I haven't actually read Dr. Sleep. Is that what you're referring to?
It's mentioned Dr. Sleep or somewhere else where, yeah, it turns out, I just spoiled Dr. Sleep for you. I'm so sorry. It turns out, though, that Tony, the voice inside of little Danny's head, is himself. It's him.
Yeah, right.
But it's not him from Dr. Sleep. It's him 10 years later.
Right. Okay.
What? 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 What did I hear you say?
You want to talk about somebody who's galaxy brained? Stephen King. The metaverse, that's a popular term now, that this man was creating decades ago.
Oh, yeah.
And it just keeps building upon is bizarre. And so it's so fascinating.
And it's like just the way that these worlds all connect for him is so strange.
Which is another reason why I think he's so hard to adapt. Do you think, I guess I'm trying to get into the mind of Kubrick here. Do you think Kubrick sits down and reads this and is like, all this other stuff I can't do? The layers upon layers of character detail and this plot point and that plot point. And because King is such a broad-minded writer and just like, I'm basically just going to get down to what I think this story's about and make my own version of it.
Yeah.
Do you think that's where the divorce happened?
I definitely think so. This is a really interesting one for me because King obviously famously dislikes the film.
Yeah.
Even to this day, he's got his critiques and I can completely understand that while still appreciating what the film does differently. Like one of the things King really dislikes, he thinks that this film doesn't have enough supernatural elements. He thinks that this is too psychological almost. And I get that criticism, but at the same time, I don't know. I think the supernatural elements are definitely there. And I to me, there's some element of King almost misinterpreting his own work to an extent. So yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one.
So are you like pro Kubrick in this instance, or are you pro King here?
I'm in the middle.
Hmm.
Yeah, you know, like I was looking at the reviews on Letterboxd and stuff, and I was like, I wouldn't go so far as to say I think this movie is overrated, but I'm definitely in the middle. I'm not on the crazy high end. I'm not on the low end. I'm just kind of, I like this movie, and I think there's a lot of things it does exceptionally well. But yeah, there are things that I don't love about it.
So if you're in the middle on this, are you in the middle on every A24 horror movie that has ever been made? Because their entire design and aesthetic is from this one film.
Absolutely it is. One of my notes was just about the score and how modern the score is. It is so modern. Like you could literally pick that score up and throw it in, like you say, any A24 film. Like, absolutely, this is the granddaddy of that style of horror, that real psychological, which I know I'm not supposed to say this because The Shining is a classic, but I think it's been done better in most A24 films. I know I'm going to get absolutely slammed for that opinion, and I'm sorry. I think this is a good movie, but I do get the critique of it. You know, like this movie was slammed by critics when it first came out. And I think that's unfair. And I think that that's just critics weren't used to. Like I say, this is a very modern horror film for sure. I just think people were not used to or expecting what this film is. But yeah, so I'm in the middle on this film.
Well, we can't talk about the score without me noting this was Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind. Carlos actually helped develop the Moog synthesizer.
Wow, yeah, right.
So they were one of the people who created that. So when we like talk about like this created modern horror, this is like almost, this movie would have been like avant-garde when it came out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And so it's at that, like it's at the cutting edge. And quite literally down to how the score was created. It was the cutting edge of synthesizers and stuff like that. So
Yeah. It's
yeah,
also one of the first films to use the Steadicam, and I must say the cinematography. I mean, it's Kubrick. Like,
yeah,
there are some things you can critique about this film, and there are some things you can't. And I think the filmmaking itself, the production, is one of those things. Like, this is a beautiful looking film. Like, the opening sequence has you hooked. That Steadicam through the mountains of the car is driving is insane. And it doesn't matter how dated the just scroll of text on screen is. I don't care. I think that it's beautiful.
and yet you're telling me that you're just in the middle of the road with this one. So what about it? Because so far, here's another one. We're just kissing its ass. What about it doesn't work for you?
Okay. As a horror film, I don't find this film scary. That's my first thing. And I know that, similar to Carrie, you could say, okay, well, it has much more going for it than that, which is an absolutely fair response, But at the end of the day, this is meant to be a horror. The book is scary. I don't find this film scary in any way. The other thing for me is that, and this is one of those things where, again, I know I'm going to get slammed. One of King's big critiques of the film was the casting of Nicholson. And I'm a little bit with him there, and I understand his problem. I think that Nicholson is great in the later half of this film where he's meant to be going true psycho. My problem is exactly the same as Stephen King's, is that because Nicholson is just such a kind of manic personality, I don't get the transition in, like, that descent into madness just doesn't exist for me, because it just feels like who he is. And so I think that for me, that actually kills the one thing this film is doing, which is that kind of psychological descent. I just don't get it. And that's where I think Stephen King had a problem with the supernatural elements. It doesn't feel like the hotel is sending this guy crazy. It just feels like this guy is crazy.
Kubrick's version of The Shining, it's almost as if The Shining awakens the house.
Yeah.
And yet it's the father who goes crazy, who also seems to be in some kind of communion with the house. So because there's no transformation with Nicholson, and it just seems like he's having his own separate connection with the house, there is no descent.
Definitely.
It's because Shelley Duvall's until the very end, right, when it reaches its peak, Wendy's oblivious to the different weird supernatural manifestations that do happen in the movie, as few as they are. She doesn't see them, right? It's Danny who sees it, or it's Jack who sees it. And they almost seem like they're on separate wings of the house, the father and the son. It's almost like they're in separate relationships with the house.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem, because it's Nicholson, that this is like something that's growing, where there's like this, the house is reaching out to him and seducing him. And then it's become a part of him, and then he's transforms into like basically a manifestation of the estate and all of its horrors and all of its whatever. Because he's Nicholson, he seems like possessed by the time he seems crazy and unhinged walking in the door.
Yes. Yeah.
And then he's just completely unfazed with Lloyd, the bartender, being there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it doesn't feel like this is a normal guy who, due to this supernatural confluence of events, is psychically being taken over by an evil place. It doesn't have that descent.
Yeah. And I get that you could say, well, this is my problem then for comparing this to the source material rather than seeing it as its own thing.
But the movie's paced like that, though. It's not just, it's the way the movie's structured. Yeah.
And so that's my biggest problem with the film, is that it is structured in that it is meant to feel like a descent, and you just don't get that. That's my number one problem with this film, is that, and I do think that, this is a critique lots of people have, and lots of people will say, well, you clearly don't get it or something. I do think there are segments of this film that are paced too slow. which I know you're not supposed to say about a Kubrick film, and it's The Shining, and you can bring up A24 and whatever. And yes, slow horror is definitely making a comeback. Like Midsummer, the director's cut, for example, is well over 3 hours long. And yet I didn't feel that film was as slow as this, because I felt the pacing and the narrative worked better for the story it was trying to tell, which is very similar in some ways. Like what Kubrick's doing here is not really a supernatural story. This is a domestic story. This is about the breakdown of a family, and you almost feel like we'd be seeing what happens on screen, maybe to a lesser extent, even if they stayed at home, which is why I think the supernatural elements don't feel as connected, because it's really just about the breakdown of this family. And Midsommar is similar in that it's about the breakdown of this couple, but I just think that it pays more attention to what's happening around it. So I think for me, the pacing of this film is a bit slow at times.
Is it possible that they learned the lessons from The Shining and said, this is great, but if he just tightened it here, or because I think about like the shock ending of this movie.
Yeah.
We cut to Jack there frozen in the ice.
Yeah.
But we linger on him. And you can tell the lingering is supposed to be the thing that is horrific.
Yeah.
But if you were to watch a A24 film, for instance, or one they would buy, that might just be like a tenth of that. Like I'm thinking of Saint Maud. I don't know if you've seen Saint Maud, and not to spoil that movie, but there's like a single frame just at the very end, and then that's right before we cut to full black.
Yeah,
and I'm thinking, okay, that's the modern way we would do it. So it's like he created the template, but is it possible directors have been refining that, at least the ones at A24 like since that point?
Absolutely. Like I said, like you can't deny it. This is the granddaddy of that genre of horror. I don't think we would have films like that if it weren't for this, and like I said, I think this was unfairly maligned at the time because people weren't used to what this film is doing. And you still have that problem now. A lot of A24 films still have pretty bad reception from general audiences, but I do think that most horror aficionados are more used to it due to films like this. But you're right. To me, moments like that, the kind of snap cut that you're talking about in something like Maud is more, to me, that creates more tension, and it's more unsettling when you get a brief window of something and then it's pulled away before you really have the time to process it.
Yeah.
Something about that really unsettles the brain. Whereas in this film, there are moments, and it's not just that ending, but there are moments where it will linger on something, and it's supposed to make you feel more uncomfortable the longer you look at it. But in effect, for me, it kind of does the opposite of that.
What do we make of Wendy not exactly being presented sympathetically at first? And I tweeted this and it did get some response. I find Shelley Duvall's performance in this movie, and we'll open it up to what she experienced in the set, because it is terrible.
Yeah.
But I find her performance to be very, very annoying. And when she walks in as like, hey, we'll get some sandwiches and stuff. I'm just like, he's like, can't you see I'm working here? And she's like, oh, I just thought maybe we could take a break. And they're just like, and she's so googly eyed and empty headed in that moment. You just want to be like, or at least I'm sitting there going, get the fuck out of there. Get out of his face.
And that's kind of my second biggest problem with the film is her acting, her character, everything about it is so anti-King. It goes back to what I was saying about Carrie, where you have those kind of underdeveloped characters. What annoys me is that that's not Wendy from the book. Wendy is quite a strong, prominent character in the book, as King is very capable of writing very strong female characters, I think.
Well, wasn't she like the head of the cheerleading squad or so? Or she was described that way as a blonde who was like, could be the head of the cheerleading squad, or was in high school as like a very strong character. And then that's not the character in the movie.
Yeah. This character is so she's basically just there to scream, really. And I don't even think Shelley Duvall does that well. I don't want to rag on her. So she was the very first Razzie winner for worst actress.
Really?
Yeah, but honestly, she's bad in this film. I don't think it's wrong to say that. She's really bad and the character is terrible.
KDK-1. This is KDK-1. We're receiving you. Over.
Hi, this is Wendy Torrance at the Overlook Hotel.
Hi, how are you folks getting on up there? Over.
Oh, we're just fine. But our telephones don't seem to be doing too well. Are the lines down by any chance? Over.
Yes, quite a few of them are down due to the storm. Over.
Any chance of them being repaired soon? Over.
Well, I wouldn't like to say. Most winters, they stay that way until spring. Over.
Boy, this storm is really something, isn't it? Over.
Oh, yes, it's one of the worst we've had for years. Is there anything else we can do for you, Mrs. Torrance? Over.
I suppose not. Over.
Well, if you folks have any problems up there, just give us a call. And Mrs. Torrance, I think it might be a good idea if you leave your radio on all the time now. Over.
Okay, we'll do that. It was real nice talking to you. Bye. Bye. Over now. Over now.
Kubrick was very unkind to her on this set.
Well, yeah, actually, so I actually don't know much about that. I only saw briefly about that the other day when, researching for this. What was he just like?
He isolated her from the rest of the cast, especially Jack. He would specifically only give compliments and praise to Jack's performance, and he would not ever give her a compliment or told her she was doing anything right.
That's terrible.
Well, yes. Now he was famous for he wouldn't like go to print on a shot or a scene until about the 35th take. So he'd run it 34 times, and knowing he was not going to use any of it, just forcing the scene over and over and over again to get whatever it is that he thought he wanted.
Yeah,
but with Duvall, he shot the going backwards up the stairs Simpsons parody. With a bat sequence 127 times.
Wow, I mean that is a lot of times.
Which is the Guinness Book, like a world record number of takes. And it's not me exaggerating. It's literally the record holder for the number of takes.
Everybody knows that a lot of takes is fairly common, but that is unheard of. Like that's, with a lot of films these days, you're talking maybe 5 or 6. Over 100 that's intense.
She said that because you're doing it that many takes, her throat was completely shot. So maybe her screams in the movie are terrible because she was having to she was already done 50 takes of it.
That seems crazy to me. That's the number one way to get a bad performance out of an actor. Doing more than that many takes, you're just exhausting them and they're just going to lose the emotion.
Well, she's got the baseball bat, right?
Yeah.
And she said her hands were like bloodied and raw because she was having to swing it wildly 127 times. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, I read her performance as being bad.
Yeah.
But is it bad because I'm getting the 27th take?
Yeah.
Is it bad because Stanley Kubrick wants her to be like when she's running up the stairs? I tweeted about this too, with a knife, and her whole body is like so wobbly, and it's like she's in such hysterics. And I'm thinking, okay, is that a bad performance or is that a real person experiencing hysterics on screen?
Yeah,
because they've been traumatized into this ridiculous state. So that's also something that conflicts me about the film.
Yeah. I still don't think her performance is good, but now I don't begrudge her for it.
Well, fair enough. When you're talking about a movie as legendary as The Shining, it's hard to watch it and feel like you don't have 10 hours to talk about it.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean,
But
this movie is an hour longer than Carrie, and I think we've spoken about it for maybe 10 minutes less.
but it's been talked about so much and
Yeah, that's true.
examined so
Yeah.
thoroughly that
Yeah.
what is there left to really say about it in comparison to some of these other movies that don't necessarily get talked about as much, or at least
Yeah.
on the same breath?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can move on from this one. Okay,
Yeah.
So for me, I'm going to give this because of all the issues that you and I brought up, I'm going to give it an 8.7 out of 10. It's going to come as my number 4 for the week.
Yeah. Cool.
Where's it sit for you?
I feel so justified. I was so worried that, because so many people very highly praised this movie, and I get that. I'm not nothing against those people. I'm just very glad that I wasn't on here kind of negative talking about this film myself. I'm a 7.5. I think that there are exceptional things about the film. Like I said, the cinematography, the score, just the style of this film was just something that didn't really exist at the time, and now has become so prominent because of this film. And it was funny. There was one thing that King said about the film, which is that even though he doesn't like it, you can't deny that a Kubrick film has something to it. Like there's just something interesting about his filmmaking that draws you in, and you almost, even though, like I said, I think there are parts that are too slowly paced for the film, I never wanted to turn it off or scroll on my phone or anything at the time. So I think there's a lot of good about this film, but yeah, so for me it's a 7.5, and it is my it's my third.
Okay. All right. Well, moving on we're getting into the wild cards now. We're moving on to 1986's Stand By Me, which currently has a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, man, where do you hear this?
8 o'clock.
What is it, man? You guys want to go see a dead body?
Columbia Pictures presents
Kid's gone. They're never gonna find him.
Not where they're looking.
a Rob Reiner film.
I'm never going to get out of this town, am I, Gordy? You can do anything you want, man.
Stand By Me.
There's 4 of us, Eyeball. You just make your move. You're dead.
Rated R.
Now in select cities. Sneak preview August 16th in additional cities.
Stand By Me was directed by Rob Reiner with a screenplay by Bruce A. Evans and Reynold Gideon. It's based on The Body by Stephen King. It's a triumphant return of Marshall Bell, last seen in Nightmare on Elm Street 2. The film was released August 8th, 1986. August 22nd, 1986, it went wide. On a budget of $7.5 to $8 million, it made $52.3 million. 4 boys become young men on a 2-day trek to face death.
4 young boys go on a journey to discover a dead body, hoping to find fame and fortune, but what they really discover is friendship.
Is that all this movie is?
No, not to me. Wait, swearing is okay, right?
Oh yeah, it's everyone.
I love this movie. I love this movie so much. And it's funny, that's almost an opinion that has gone out of vogue. Like, I was messaging my former co-host and I was like, Stand By Me is great. He's like, yeah, I don't rate it.
Wow.
And to me, this movie does everything it's trying to do so well. Like, everything it's aiming for, it achieves. And I think this movie is about, I mean, obviously it's a coming of age story. That's obvious. As you said, a lot of King's work involves that element. But like, this is about relationships, and like those relationships that you form and will never forget. And I love this movie so much.
There's something about this movie, including the narration, that just draws me into it.
Yeah.
To the point where I feel like you feel like the heat of the summer.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you feel the dirt. You feel like, and I think it's just tapping into such a common experience of just like, you're not quite like, you're not like a teenager, but you're not like a kid anymore, but you're still kind of a kid.
Yeah.
And it's the line at the end of the movie, which is like, I don't think I ever had better friends than I had when I was 12. And he's like, Jesus, does anybody? And the answer is no. For most people, the answer is no.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like
and he somehow captures this in the story, and Reiner somehow captures that in the film.
Absolutely. The sense of, it's amazing. When I messaged Topher, part of he was like, I didn't see it when I was a kid. So I was like, neither did I. I actually only saw this movie for the first time. It would have been in the last 10 years, definitely. And I obviously was not a kid in the 50s either, as shocking as that may be. And yet, the level of nostalgia that this film is able to impart despite that is insane, because I watched this movie and, like you say, you feel it. You get that feeling. I remember walking the streets with my friends when I was around like 11, 12 years old, and you felt invincible. You're like, I'm 12 now. I can walk around by myself. I could go camping in the middle of nowhere. Like, it's just amazing how much this film is able to give that feeling off timelessly, I think.
Yeah, because I'm like you. I wasn't Marty McFly and like or George McFly in 1955. Like I was, I'm a contemporary human being. And it's not my experience, but somehow by being so specific, it is common.
Yes.
Yes. Because it's such a specific place and time, it just transcends. And you just connect to it because we've all had that experience of best friends at a certain age, and you might not be best friends 6 months from now. You may never see that person after middle school or high school, but in that summer, in that moment, you are like brothers, and you have some trip, like you said, some camping in the woods, or in this case, going to find a dead body. That you just have that kind of defining moment of your friendship that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. And I think the other thing this movie has is, maybe not today, but certainly like in the 90s, so about 5-10 years after this movie came out, it played on cable all the time, and I was a kid and it hooked me. I wasn't a nostalgic old dad looking back at, I was younger or roughly the same age as the characters. Now I'm getting closer to the dad's age, and the movie still hooks me because I connect more now with the Dreyfuss character, who's
with that idea of looking back. Yeah,
and so I think this movie, if it does hook you, is also timeless in that way. The story is timeless, and in that framework, the two eras are like kind of timeless. Your main, like, both iterations of that character, you can relate to both of them. So,
I think the way this movie achieves that really is through the characters. I think, like I said before, King is so good at establishing characters, and what he does so well is, I like to think of myself as hopefully one day being a writer, currently doing a degree in creative writing. And one thing that you learn is that specificity in characters is what makes them grounded and feel real. Give a character an interest, give them, some kind of opinion, and be specific about it, because that's what makes them feel like a real fleshed out person. But what King does so well is blending that with these really kind of generic, like everybody had the friend who was this, and everybody had
like
the friend
archetypes
who was that. And so by by casting these four boys under those archetypes, but then being specific with who they are individual of that, it just hooks you in so much. And not even to mention that this has to be the best example of child acting ever put to film. I think there's an argument for Haley Joel Osment in The Sixth Sense, who's exceptional, but the fact that all four of these boys carry this film is crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've got obviously River Phoenix, and who is just an incredible, just a standout. You've got Will Wheaton. This is the last time I could get through anything Will Wheaton was in. You got, Corey Feldman, and you got Jerry O'Connell.
Yeah.
And not one of them gives a false note or a false. They seem like just a group of real kids, but they don't.
Yeah.
It's just they're Hollywood kids, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But yet somehow they're real at the same time.
Yeah, you watch Will Wheaton's performance in this film, and it's almost mind-boggling that he didn't go on to become one of the biggest stars in the world. That he kind of, he fell into Next Generation and then almost into obscurity. Really, these days, he's more of a personality now than he is an actor, even. And it's crazy to think that, looking at his performance in this film, where he is just so perfect from start to finish. He's so real, and you care about him so much.
Yeah, their interactions with each other ring true.
Yeah.
Their interactions with the larger world, the things they decide to do, the trouble, the mischief they decide to get into, their fears, how they would react. Like it's just all so relatable, and it's all so authentic. Even though it has this like very warm Hollywood glow to it almost. And it's got Kiefer Sutherland, and it's got all these like actorly types in it.
Yeah.
And it has this like super warm Rob Reiner tone to it.
Yeah.
Visually. And yet it's like, oh, this feels very real.
Yeah, it's crazy that given the subject matter, like they're going to find a dead body, and just bad things happen to them and around them and have happened with their families and stuff. And yet, you're right, the movie feels incredibly warm and fuzzy. Like it gives off that feeling like a warm hug, even though it's like the subject matter is not for the most part that nice.
No.
Because that kind of stuff doesn't, like, what matters to the characters and the kids for the majority of this film is their friendship. It's just, and that's the feeling they get from each other. And so that's the feeling that's passed on to the audience. So the rest of the stuff doesn't matter almost. It's just, like Will Wheaton's dad, Gordy's dad is a dick to him and genuinely thinks that he should have died instead of his brother. But when you think of this movie, what you remember is Chris, River Phoenix, telling him, your dad doesn't hate you, he just doesn't know you. Like that warm moment, the friendship that they feel for each other, that's what is passed on through the lens. And it just works so well for me.
Well, the movie really is, it's that warm, fuzzy movie, draws you in, like you said. But it's also, what it really is, it's a meditation on death and grief.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Ray Brower's dead. In the beginning, that's the whole premise, right? Is that Ray Brower got knocked out of his shoes by this train. We overheard where the dead body was. Vern did, and we're going to go find it. That's okay. That's the inciting incident. But also Denny's dead. His brother is dead.
Yeah.
And so you could understand, like, this is a kid wrestling with losing maybe the only person in his immediate family who loved him.
Yeah.
And so you can understand the attraction to death in a way. Like he needs to go see this dead body as a way of processing his brother's death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, the other kids are just kind of kids, and, but I don't know. I just lost the plot on what I was going to say, but it's a dour movie, like you said, but it doesn't feel that way. Yeah, and ultimately, the movie ends with Chris's death. It starts with death. It's about death. We're processing death, and then and loss and grief, and like was like inevitability, and like who are we going to grow into, and aging, and the kids are afraid of aging, and it's like it's all this sort of stuff, and like you don't think about it as being like, well, that's the one where just. They all like 12-year-olds have an existential crisis on their way to finding a dead body.
Yeah.
And have to pull a gun on their bullies to stop them from killing them.
Yeah.
But it's such a warm family, like almost borderline family film.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And you're right. Like by seeing that dead body, it gives Gordy that closure over his brother's death. And then again, by reliving this journey and writing the story down, that's how he gets that closure on Chris's death in current day as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, this one, oh man. In a way, I knew it was going to be this high. I almost wrestled with making it higher.
Yeah.
Which I know that's like when you're talking about Stephen King adaptations, you're talking about some of the movies in this list. Maybe this one wouldn't be so high for some people, but I am going to put this in at my number 2 for the week. It was almost my number 1, but I it's like but I couldn't quite do it. I give it a 9.5 out of 10. I think it's that good, and that's really, really, really high for me.
Yeah,
I think it's that good.
I love how close we've been so far. I'm exactly the same. This is my number 2. It's a 9 out of 10. I think this is a near perfect film. Like, I personally, I don't love the music in the film. I actually don't like the fact that this film is tied so heavily to that pop song. But that happens, and that's fine. But I'm a 9. I absolutely love this film. Oh man, I hope we have the same number 1 then, because if not,
it's gonna go one of two ways.
Well, yeah, because I already said I really dislike one of the films, so
it's gonna go one of two ways, folks, and I think we're about to find out. Of course, we're talking about 1994's The Shawshank Redemption, which currently has a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes.
By the power vested in me by the state of Maine, I hereby order you to serve 2 life sentences back to back.
Spellbinding, riveting, unforgettable. The Shawshank Redemption is one of the best films of the year. An emotional blockbuster, a monumental achievement in filmmaking.
What are we talking about?
The Shawshank Redemption, rated R, at select theaters Friday.
The Shawshank Redemption was written and directed by Frank Darabont. It is based on Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. It is the triumphant return of Morgan Freeman, last seen in Deep Impact. It's the triumphant return of Paul McCrane, last seen in RoboCop. It's the triumphant return of Mark Rolston Allens, last seen in I Don't Remember.
I'm going to check that film out. I don't recall that one.
It was released September 10th, 1994 at TIFF, and September 23rd, 1994 in the United States on a budget of $25 million. This thing made $75.3 million. A misunderstood banker and potential murderer suffers decades of indignities while clinging to hope at the hand of a corrupt penal system.
Yeah, this was really hard to condense down into a single. The story of 2 men and their friendship as they navigate years of highs and lows in the prison system. Let me just say that this is not the film I dislike. I love this film a lot, a hell of a lot. And it's almost a bit naff to say that. This film was famously like the number 1 on the top 250 IMDb for a very, very long time. I think there's a lot of people out there who, while they like the film, don't think that it ever really justified that kind of status. But, I mean, geez, I love this film a lot. I actually only saw it for the first time 2 years ago.
Wow.
And I had almost avoided it because it had such a high status. I like to be a bit of a contrarian. And so by not having watched it, I could do that because I didn't need to agree with people or disagree with people. I haven't seen it. But I was forced to watch it. Yeah, it must have been about 2-3 years ago by a patron of the show. And I'm so grateful that I finally watched it because now it's one of my favorite films. I think that this is virtually a flawless film. Oh, no.
I know. Hey, no. I watched Stand By Me. I'm just so moved every time I watch the movie.
Yeah.
Like, I actually have to be very selective of when I watch it. Because if I'm in a certain play, I'm like, I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
But I watched it for the show. And so when I'm done with that experience, because I'm watching them chronologically, I'm like, I don't want The Shawshank Redemption to be as good as the movie I just watched. Because I want I want to be able to say, well, actually, Stand By Me is the better one, and Shawshank is good, but it's not that good because here's some flaws I found in it.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. This is there's nothing bad about this movie.
Nothing.
What boggles the mind the most is the struggles of telling a narrative over this period of time. Like this is a movie that spans not years, not a single decade. This spans multiple decades.
Yep.
And yet the pacing is spot on. The structure of the narrative is spot on. You care about every single one of these characters. This is one of those things I was talking about with King, where even a lot of the side characters are still fleshed out. Like when old mate who runs the library leaves and can't handle the outside, it's those small details. This could have easily just been a film literally about the two main characters, Red and Andy. It could have been, but that's not King. Like it's so much more than that, and it's just a beautiful film.
Yeah, in a lesser work, we don't care about Brooks Hanlon.
Yeah.
We don't care about any of these, any of these other side characters or any of these little. So yeah, we're just and if that happens, then it almost becomes a series of vignettes.
Yeah.
Because we're just watching the one character we care about go through a situation, and then something else happens, and that's all it would be. But because the world is so fleshed out, even though we're going through the passage of time, making these jumps and all this sort of stuff, it doesn't feel pocketed. It doesn't feel like I said, a series of vignettes. It's paced perfectly, so it feels like you're just on this linear story, that I don't it doesn't feel choppy, it doesn't feel over long, it doesn't feel like, oh well, there's some stuff missing, and it feels like we flash forward too far, or like it just is this immersive world that is very cleverly giving you the passage of time with stuff like Sam the bird getting a little, or Jake rather, aging. We don't even leave the shot. We don't even leave, somebody goes out one door and comes back in another, or it's two scenes butting up to each other, and we can just tell, the mutton chop, the sideburns are different. So another 4 years or 5 years or 6 years must have gone by.
Yeah.
But you're not thinking about it. It's effective because it just happens.
Yeah. I think that Darabont is almost as strong a writer as Stephen King. And so the relationship between them makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that this. Darabont, their relationship started because he was part of Stephen King's Dollar Baby program. He bought the rights to one of King's short stories for $1, and he still runs this program today to kind of help filmmakers learn how to adapt. And I love King for so many reasons, but that's just one of them. And part of the clause of this contract is that you're not allowed to release the film, but you have to send a copy to Stephen King. And King saw this film and loved it so much that I forget what it is, but he gave Darabont the rights to this for virtually nothing. It was almost a gift. And I just think that this adaptation is so incredibly strong. And like most studios would gawk at someone saying they want to make this, it's hard to describe because it's a prison movie, but part of me wants to describe it as a feel-good movie in some ways. It must have been a hell of a lot of work to get this film past the studio at this length. But thank God it's not cut any shorter. It's just perfect. It feels so right.
How do we get to the point where we feel collegial with other than Andy, murderers?
Well, yeah.
that whole lunch table of guys, by the time we're in the midpoint of the movies and Andy's in good standing with them, we like them.
Yeah, and that they're murderers. That regardless of how much he's rehabilitated or whatever, that Morgan Freeman's Red is a killer.
Yes.
And I still think that the movie does an interesting thing where for a long time I feel like it actually remains quite ambiguous over Andy's. The fact that the movie opens with Andy with the gun outside the house and stuff.
Yeah.
I still think to this day, even towards the end, it is questionable. I think that we want to believe he didn't do it because we care about him so much. And obviously you get told that there's an admittance by someone else who says they did it. But I still think that this movie does a pretty masterful job of saying it doesn't matter. Like, you'll care about this character whether he did it or not. Like, his innocence isn't the reason that we're following this story.
It shouldn't work.
Yeah, it shouldn't. And yet it does so much.
And yet it does. Yeah, and yet it does so much. The ending shouldn't work because it should feel schmaltzy.
Yeah.
It should feel cheesy. It should feel like, he gets out of prison, he gets away with the money. That's cool. But then Red gets out, and then Red finds him, and it ends up with them hugging. I think even Tim Robbins, is wearing a white shirt on the beach, like all white people do on vacation. And you're like, this should be cheesy and corny. These two guys, potentially one confirmed murderer and one potential wife murderer.
Yeah.
Or if at the very least, if you didn't murder his wife, admittedly was an asshole.
Yeah.
We've gotten to care about them. And now this moment, which could be corny, isn't corny. It's filled with life and hope, and you feel invigorated by it.
Exactly.
And that's what makes this like a transcendent movie that you almost want to say it can't be that good. And then it is, because even the stuff that would be cliche in another movie, it doesn't feel cliche here.
Well, that's the thing. In any lesser movie, like I don't like the tearjerker genre, which I don't think this film is, but it borders on it. Like I'm a crier, and there are several moments I cry in this film. And most movies that do that do come off as disingenuous. Like a lot of movies like that, I think it feels like their sole purpose is to make the audience cry, because that tricks you and makes you feel like you have an emotional connection to the characters, even if you don't. But this movie doesn't do that. This movie genuinely makes you cry because you have that emotional connection to the characters. It doesn't need to trick you into that feeling. It just genuinely does it. And I think a lot of that is the writing, the fact that they didn't cut themselves short on the length of the film. Like, this movie doesn't feel long, and any less, and you might not have as deep a connection to the characters, because you see these characters grow over years and years and years. And so you really do feel that by the end of the film, I think. Plus the score is just incredible. Like,
the Thomas Newman score, again, there's certain notes of it where I'm like, or certain parts of it that I'm just like, that should feel schmaltzy, manipulative and schmaltzy, but it doesn't. It feels right. It feels like it feels perfect for this film.
Yeah.
And I any other day I would have been like, Shawshank Redemption. But for that day I'm watching Stand By Me, I'm like, this is the time I want to be able to say Shawshank's not that good. But it is.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm going to give it a 9.75 out of 10. And it is my best of the week. I'm adding it to the short list.
Yeah, this is also my number one of the week. It's my best. It is a straight up 10 for me. I typically don't do the decimal thing on my show, so I'm kind of just ingrained. If it's a 9.75, that's a 10 for me. Like, this is just there is. I honestly cannot think of anything about this film that is a disservice to the storytelling, to the narrative. Like, I just think everything, it's lightning in a bottle almost. Every element comes together so incredibly well. Like, Darabon's direction, some of those beautiful shots, like those sweeping overviews of the prison. And I cannot imagine the challenges of filming in a real prison where you have actual walls and stuff that can't be moved, but like, it's just from
that
start
prison
to finish, it's perfect.
That prison is a real prison.
Yeah.
And it is located 45 minutes from sunny tropical Akron, Ohio, where I am.
Really? No shit. Yeah. Wow.
And I've driven by it a million times on the highway, but I've never been there. They do tours of it and stuff like that. And you would think like I could go to the Shawshank prison and do a tour and see where they filmed a lot of the stuff. And I've never done it. Shame on me as the movie nerd. But Yeah, I've driven by it a million times. And I was like, well, Shawshank was there, and it doesn't look like it's changed at all since that period of time. So
wow,
yeah,
that's awesome.
And knowing where it's at, I can't imagine how difficult it would have been to try to shoot a film there.
Yeah. I just think that this film is just, like I said, perfect. Easily my best of the binge.
All right, well, that leaves only one. And this is, I don't know. This is going to be potentially controversial. I'm not sure.
All right.
We're talking about 2017's It, which currently has an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Look, everywhere it happens, it's all connected by the sewers. What happened? If we stick together, all of us will win.
Make it a wonderful day. Kill them all! Kill them all!
It, rated R, September 8th.
It was directed by Andy Muschietti with a screenplay by Chase Palmer, Cary Fukunaga, and Gary Dauberman. It is based on It by Stephen King. It was released September 5th, 2017 at the TCL Chinese Theater and September 8th, 2017 in the United States. On a budget of $35 million, it made $701.8 million at the box office. Preteens forego sewer orgy, but not their worst fears in their fight against cosmic clown horror.
There is an unsettling and evil presence in the town of Derry, and it's focused itself on 7 children with an aim to feed on their fear.
This movie came out. I saw it in theaters. I liked it.
Okay, yeah.
I have not. It wasn't like I didn't love it, but I was like, I liked it.
Mm-hmm.
I have not revisited. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but I have not. I don't own it. I haven't this isn't part of my weekly routine in my life is to watch this movie. It was a one and done experience for me. So I went into it with having a good impression of it overall.
Yep.
And I don't know. The movie doesn't really work for me anymore.
Yeah, this is probably the second most disappointed I've ever been leaving a theater. This is my favorite King book. I love this book. And part of me still thinks maybe this is my problem just because I love the book so much. I had the highest hopes for this film. Like I took a friend who knew nothing about it. I was like, we got to go see this. I can't wait for this movie. I love the book. People are saying this movie is great. And I hated it. I thought it was complete garbage from start to finish. And surprisingly, I actually have revisited it quite a few times. A couple of years ago on our show, we did a movie mass debate with a couple of other podcasters about the merits of this movie, where some of us were arguing for it. Some of us, myself included, were against it. And so I had to rewatch it for that. Rewatching it the other night for this show as part of the binge, I was able to appreciate some elements of it, but I still I do not like this movie.
Where does it break down for you? Why doesn't it work?
So have you read the book?
I have not. I'm intimidated. It's like a phone book.
Yeah, it's pretty fat. It's pretty, like people talk about The Stand, but it is it's pretty fat.
Yeah.
What really, really falls apart in this film for me is the structure and the storytelling and the narrative. I know that it is a daunting process. Like you say, this is a big book. So it's a daunting process to think about adapting this. But I just think they went about it the wrong way. The split between part 1 and 2, splitting the child and adult timelines, for me, I just can't understand that decision, because the intertwining of those two narratives is what makes the structure of the story work. Because what happens as adults is effectively exactly what happens as children. So I already watched this movie getting angry about part 2 because I was like, well, now I know that they're going to change things. Otherwise, it's just the same movie with adults instead of kids. And that's just silly. They're not going to do that. So I already knew that they were going to be altering things. But that structure of flashing back and forwards, it would almost be like if someone took the show Lost and decided to cut all the flashbacks out of it and show them first. You know, like you're losing any kind of character development and structure and nuance by doing it that way. And so that instantly was my biggest problem. The second problem for me is that this film really, like I said to you before, to me, the book is almost closer to Stand By Me for most parts than it is to any of his horror stuff.
Right.
This film keeps a little bit of that, really just to do nothing but kind of give you a feeling of nostalgia. And apart from that, it tries to make this into a straightforward horror, and my problem is it's not scary. This film just relies on jump scares from start to finish.
Yeah.
It has a real heavy focus on Pennywise the Clown, whereas in the book, the point is that it can kind of appear as any of your fears. And Pennywise is just kind of one of them that we see sparingly. But in this, it's almost like Pennywise is it. And so, I don't know, it just didn't land for me.
I think the movie I think it's self-aware of the TV movie Tim Curry, which is why I think it focused so much on Pennywise.
Yeah.
You know, because it's to me, it almost feels like a parody of a Nightmare on Elm Street movie more than it. I didn't notice that when I watched it in the theaters and enjoyed it, but the way that it's just a series of kids basically have nightmares, surrealistic nightmares, and Pennywise, appears, and if it was Freddy, he'd kill the kids one at a time. Yeah. Pennywise doesn't. He comes out, there's a jump scare, and then boom, the encounter's over. And I'm just like, but the encounters are they almost have that like Nightmare on Elm Street, like semi-comedic factor to them.
Yeah.
Especially like the Elm Street sequels. And this movie's like tonally kind of like that. And I'm like, if they made a modern Nightmare on Elm Street, it would be it. It would be, instead of Pennywise, it'd be Freddy.
Yeah.
And that would be, and this is how they would do it. And so therefore it just doesn't hold up as like its own. I think it's self-aware of the 80s, the New Kids on the Block stuff. I think there's references to Nightmare on Elm Street in the movie, like on the marquee and stuff like that, I think.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I get what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're imitating a scary movie. You're not a scary movie.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing for me, is that I just don't actually get scared once in this film.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of moments where it wants you to be scared, but they're really nothing more than jump scares. I think like the opening scene for this film is so far and away the best thing that happens in the film.
Yes.
Like it's fairly faithful to the book.
Yeah.
It's actually fairly scary. And then from that point on, you just get a bunch of Pennywise running at the screen while kind of shaking weirdly. And you're like, am I meant to be scared by this? Because I'm just not. Like, I get it. He can go cross-eyed. That's kind of cool, but I'm not scared.
Well, you're also forgetting the like bong or the clatter and the boom. Yeah. It's like we gotta bang pots and pans at the same time that he's running at you sideways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as like the references to other scary movies, like you were saying, I actually don't hate that. That actually is a large part of the book. Like, so the book obviously set in the 50s, not the 80s. Yeah. And a lot of the times Pennywise appears, it is as kind of horror movie monsters of the time.
Like the Wolfman.
The werewolf and, and I don't mind that. But you're right. This movie kind of skirts around that and ends up feeling like a parody rather than actually playing into that, because that is the kind of stuff that kids would be scared of, like the movies and stuff that they've seen, but instead this 90% of the time just goes with a clown. like we get the painting lady, and we get Eddie's leper, and like they're scary, but it just doesn't do it for me.
For the life of me, I don't know. I think this was put out by Warner Brothers, right?
Yeah. Well,
Warner Brothers.
I think it was New Line,
but New Line was owned by Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
Freddy Krueger is owned by New Line.
Yeah, I had the same thought. Yeah,
I don't understand why he at one point didn't turn into Freddy Krueger.
To me, that would be worthwhile. If you're updating this movie to the 80s, that
Right.
would make so much sense.
Because the werewolf doesn't appear, because it wouldn't make sense for a kid to be afraid of a werewolf in the
Exactly.
80s. So they got rid of the werewolf, and it's just Pennywise.
Yeah.
He doesn't transform into the werewolf. I think his claws grow out a little bit like the werewolf, but that's about it. That's like a little visual reference. And I'm like, nah, it makes more sense in that scene that he would turn into Freddy Krueger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or because they own the rights to him. And if you're going to have it on the marquee, and this is, rather than just having it be another generic Pennywise encounter, like you said, you could, so it just, again, it feels, I don't know how to describe it other than to say it feels like a parody at times of a horror movie. And when it gets to the friendship and the summer and the whatever, it almost feels like a parody of Stand By Me.
Yeah.
It lacks some kind of that, whatever that authenticness we talked about in some of these other movies. This doesn't have that same feeling. And so it comes off as phony. And then on top of that, all the scares are CGI for the most part.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's not great CGI.
Yeah. So it just doesn't, doesn't scare you because it doesn't feel real at all.
To me, I would describe this movie as being soulless. Like, I just think, firstly, by killing that structure of King's narrative, that takes so much out of what the story is actually saying. And then even the update to the 80s, I kind of felt at the time like you could make the argument that, people watching this today were kids in the 80s. So, let's go off that. I didn't feel that. I kind of felt like they more changed it to bank off nostalgia from shows like Stranger Things and stuff, which was really big at the time. Like, I felt that to me felt more like a soulless marketing move. People are into the 80s at the moment. Like we've got, what was the Spielberg one? Ready Player One, I think had just come out. You've got a lot of kind of, the 80s are big at the moment in nostalgia. To me, it felt more like a soulless move rather than anything to do with the narrative itself.
You thought it was just a cash grab and not necessarily
which it got me off its side from the moment it started. But like I said, rewatching the other night, I was able to appreciate a few more things about it. I think that the dialogue between the children is pretty well written and realistic. Like that to me is one of the few things that rings true. And it's like, okay, that's the way that kids, or that's certainly the way me and my friends spoke to each other growing up. Like, so that's good. And that's
when you were also looking for dead bodies, because this is another group of kids looking for dead children. So when you and your friends were looking for dead bodies in a sewer, this is how you spoke to each other. That's what
and I
saying.
also quite like the score at times, but really for me that's about where it ends with this movie for me.
Again, I think like a very, very generic, dumbed down experience. It's fine. There's enough laughs. There's enough, especially like the Eddie character. Some of these performances from the kids are pretty good. I think, Mike, Georgie, Eddie, Bev are the standouts. I think those, especially like Sophia Lillis. I think she's great.
She's great. She is fantastic. And that's part of the thing that bugged me too, is I think the casting is so good that, like, why not just stick closer to what King wrote, which I don't know. Again, this is one of my things where I'm struggling with the adaptation of it. That just, it's probably more my own issue than the film's, but I can't separate it at this point.
For me, it just doesn't, in comparison to Stand By Me and in comparison to Shawshank Redemption, even some of the other ones, every other one that we watched on this week, it just doesn't, it's not in the same league. You can't put it in the same category. It's just missing. We took time in every previous movie to talk about something unique and special about it.
Yeah.
And I can't find that in this film. Yeah. It's not that the individual parts of it are terrible. I just don't see anything really like unique or, it's missing that like that excellence that some of these other films have. And this one just does not have it. It's just, I guess it is. It's soulless. That's just probably the best way to put it. So I give it an 8 out of 10. Now that we've talked about it, I'd probably rate it a little bit lower than that, but I'm not going to pick nits here. So it's an 8 out of 10 for me. It is my worst of the week for sure.
Yeah. I'm probably going to sound really harsh here. This is a 5 for me. I just think it's extraordinarily average. I just think that, like you say, it's the kind of film that if it's on, like, I'm not going to get angry about watching it, except when I think about my love for the book. I think as a film on its own, if you're just there to watch it and have a good time, it's fine. And I think it does an okay job. But yeah, for me, I just, like I said, it's my own problem. I just can't separate it. And I just think that it kills so many things that the original, like, honestly, also, I know people rag on it these days, and people still praise Tim Curry, but most people think it's pretty out of fashion. But I would watch the 1990 miniseries way before I thought about throwing this on. So for me, it is my worst of the week.
Okay. All right. Well, it's time for our recap. Coming in dead last for me is It, 8 out of 10. Followed at number 4 with The Shining, which I give an 8.7 out of 10. Coming in the middle of the pack is Carrie. I appreciated, you heard everything I had to say. I waxed on poetic for a million years. I give it a 9 out of 10. It still can't beat Stand By Me, which is 9.5 out of 10, is number 2 for the week. And it sure as hell can't beat The Shawshank Redemption, which is as good as your dad told you it was, coming in at number 1 with a 9.75 out of 10. Billy, what is your recap?
Yep, here's mine. So my worst of the week was It at 5 out of 10. Coming in at 4th is Carrie at 7 out of 10. The Shining, 7.5 out of 10. Stand By Me, one of my all-time favorites at 9 out of 10. And like you say, it's a bit of a dad film. It feels naff to praise this film as much as I have, but I cannot fault it. Shawshank is best of the week at 10 out of 10.
You lived up to all of the hype and all of the many, many downloads around the world that you get deservedly. I listened to your show. I think you do a hell of a job. You got that soothing tone, that therapeutic tone, and you can be a contrarian, but even when you are, you're just so soothing. The only place where I'm at odds with you is you say that you are a frequent toilet goer.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what it means to be a frequent toilet goer? And let's straighten this out before you get your plug.
Okay, all right. So it is exceptionally rare that I'll be able to sit through a movie without going to the toilet. So the other night I saw Morbius, which is not a long film and not a good film, just quietly.
Yeah.
And I needed a bathroom break. I have a bladder the size of a walnut. It's just tiny.
So any movie that you see, no matter the length or runtime, you will go to the toilet.
Oh yeah,
while you're there.
Yeah, and I try combat it. I go to the toilet before I walk in. I do all the right things. I just can't help it.
Because one of the things I'm notorious for on here is having mini rants about people who get up and move and come in and out of the theater or on the cell phones or come in late or this, that, whatever, or bring in their, very smelly sushi or whatever. And
I've also been known to eat sushi in the cinema. So.
Warm, hot Australian sushi, the stuff that's baked in the sun of the South Pacific. And you walk in and you're
It has been known to happen where I haven't had to go to the bathroom. If a film is like insanely engrossing, I think Mother a couple of years ago was probably the first film where I remember not going to the bathroom during it because I just couldn't look away.
Well, despite you being a frequent toilet goer in the cinemas, you have earned your plug, sir, and your great listenership. You have a great show. where can people find you out there on the interwebs?
Well, thank you so much. Firstly, this was so much fun. I had so much fun doing this. This was awesome. Secondly, I should clarify, I wouldn't say that I'm a toilet goer in the cinema. I do walk outside and find the bathroom first.
I'm just saying that Billy has been outed as a man who looks at movie theaters as public toilets.
Public restrooms all over the place. Look, you can find me anywhere that you can find podcasts. If you're listening to this, you can probably find me just by searching We Watched a Thing. You can get in touch with me at wewatchedathing.com or wewatchedathing@gmail.com, and I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all under the handle at We Watched a Thing. But I mean, before you do that, just go back and listen to Jason's entire catalog because it's awesome.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, if you happen to follow B Dizzle from We Watch a Thing and you're listening to Binge Movies for the first time, well, thank you for listening. And yeah, you can find us in all of your favorite podcast places. We extend into the entire multiverse of podcast platforms. So we're all over the place. And we also have a Patreon, patreon.com/binge movies. This show would not be possible without our patrons. We love you. And you can find us on Twitter at Binge Movies. Let us know that we should have talked about The Shining for 7.5 hours and only talked about Carrie for 10 minutes. And let us know that we are elder geriatric millennials who don't understand the genius that is 2017's It. Send your hate mail to at Binge Movies. And until next time, binge on.